Oh, good morning. Good to see everybody today. Welcome to fall. School's back in session. Any parents in the house? Like, woo woo! Day drinking. If you're a guest today, I'm the lead pastor here at Crossroads. Let's just get this started off right. I will disappoint you, okay? That is just how it's going to happen. So it is great to have everybody here today. My name is Ryan. I'm the lead pastor here at Crossroads. We were just chatting about this series on the Revelation. It has all kinds. I couldn't imagine trying to be an ASL interpreter for this message series on the Revelation and these crazy words and things like that. So if you're a guest today, thank you for being here. Inside the program, there's a little note from me, and my cell phone is in there. If after today you have any, for whatever reason you decide to maybe stick around, or you have a question, or you'd like to get together, I'd love to have coffee, have an old-fashioned, whatever works for you. You can text me, and we'll get together, and I'll answer any question you might have about my journey, our church. I'd love to hear your story and how they're kind of intersecting. It's just one of the fun things I love to do, so that's in there. And if you've been around for a while and we've never gotten a chance to meet personally, get together, do that. Do me a favor, shoot me a text message, and we'll get together. That is my cell phone number, by the way. It's the one in the note. All right, and just send me that. That'd be wonderful. All right, so we're in this series, The Peacemaker's Guide to the Revelation. If you haven't been able to be here for the last few weeks, I will say this might be a little confusing because they kind of build off of each other. I'll do my best to help connect the dots in case you haven't been able to be here. And this book, The Revelation, is the last book of the Christian Bible, we call it the New Testament. It's the craziest book. It's caused all kinds of harm and damage and bizarro interpretations, and people are often scared of it, and we just usually ignore it because of that. But we've just been kind of talking about how can we approach this literature in a healthy way.
Hey, good morning, everyone. Jumping in here in the middle of this talk because we had some audio problems for a few moments. And so rather than there be a strange kind of break in the audio, I thought maybe we'd just give you a little bit of context of what you might have missed. What I was talking about here was how oftentimes we go to our friends, we go to family because we want opinions. And we do this because we're struggling in some sense. Sometimes we struggle with little things. Hey, where should we eat dinner? We struggle with, what do you think about this movie, right? There's a little bit of a struggle there. Should we go see it? Should we not go see it? So we go get opinions. Hey, what movie should we watch tonight? Or where should we go to dinner? And that's a minor struggle, right? And we want the diverse opinions there. We want these opinions that kind of give us a broad perspective. We want different voices, folks that like action movies or drama or romance. And so we want to hear from them, like what they believe would be a great movie to watch. Not a lot of pressure there. We want the diverse opinions. But sometimes there are things where we're kind of struggling and we don't really want diverse opinions. We want like some opinions to kind of move us in one direction. I know I was talking on Sunday how I've kind of become interested in options trading in the stock market, and real little, real small, just kind of trying to learn some things. I like learning new things. But when I go to YouTube and I like search option trading strategies, there's 1,000,001 people that they've got it all figured out. And that diverse opinions doesn't really help me in my struggle, right? And so I just was talking about, hey, sometimes we want these diverse opinions, and that's great. And we go and seek opinions because we're in some sort of a struggle or a tension. But sometimes the opinions, or sometimes the struggle is pretty great. It's pretty big, and it comes with some pressure. And we don't necessarily want diverse opinions, but we want second opinions. And so that's where we'll pick up the conversation in the talk on Sunday.
But sometimes we need more than just diverse opinions. Sometimes we want second opinions, right? Like sometimes we're making big decisions that come with massive amounts of impact in our lives. We get some big news. We're trying to make this big decision. We want a second opinion, and we're actually looking to see if we can garner some opinions that are in alignment, right, to help us get a better understanding of the situation. So maybe we get a medical diagnosis, or maybe we're thinking about going to work at a new place, maybe moving to a new neighborhood, right? And so we have these moments where we go, I'm going to get another opinion. I want to talk to a few people. And in those moments, okay, When all of a sudden we get conflicting opinions, it's not really as helpful and it can become quite stressful. Why? Because conflicting opinions in those major decisions in our lives, they force us to do something. They force us to make a choice. We have to make up our minds. Like, I have to decide, am I going to move there? Am I going to work there? We actually have to own that decision ourselves. And when one person loves working there and one person hates working there, one person loves living there, one person hates living there. One person loves going to church there. One person will never go back to church there. By the way, if you live in this area, you should join the Lovelanders Facebook group if you're on Facebook. I know, boomer, I get it, it's Facebook, but what I love about it is every now and then I'll get a notification that like somebody has posted in Lovelanders, hey, we're looking for a church, and they describe what they're looking for. And then everybody and their mom puts why they love their church, doesn't pay any attention to what that person wants in a church, lists the churches. And so you get like 50 churches, everybody defending why their church is the best. I'm just like, this can't be very helpful if you're actually trying to find a church, you know? And it's like, that's where it's like, now I have to make up my decision. But when you're given like 50 options, differing opinions, you can go into what's called what? Paralysis analysis, right? It's just like, what do I do? And this whole process, right, that flows out of an internal struggle where we're trying to get some advice can actually make the struggle more difficult. And if it's a simple struggle of where to have dinner as a family tonight, no big deal, low risk. But then we have complex struggles, right? Should our family move across the nation? That's a little higher risk. And then we can amp it up a little more, and we have existential struggles. The big questions in life. What is life all about? What is the meaning of life? Right? Maybe you're in here and you're a person of faith, or you're exploring faith, and you're trying to say, hey, like, okay, you talk about this peacemaking path of Jesus here, like, if I'm going to try and follow it, like, how do I invest my time? What does it require of me? What am I supposed to do? What happens when you die? 55,000 different opinions. What is threatening life as we know it on this planet? These are big existential questions. And here's what I know about these questions and opinions. As the stakes get higher in the struggle, in the question, right? As the stakes get higher, the diversity of opinions get louder, right? And turmoil grows stronger. Welcome to an election year. That's all I'm going to say about that. We haven't received the offering yet, so I'm not going to get political. Right? But that's the truth of it. If we're honest, if it's a really highly sensitive, like when the stakes get higher, everybody gets louder. There's not room for diverse opinions. You're either right or wrong. We go into the binary way of thinking, black and white, and then the turmoil grows stronger. And it's not just our own inner turmoil, right? It's societal turmoil. It's turmoil in the neighborhood. It's turmoil against people who maybe have a different or diverse opinion. We're not talking about the melting pot, whether we go to dinner there, right? We're talking about how the economy should function, or who should be allowed to vote, or all these massive ideas in our culture, right? And now this idea of tension in culture and how we exist, this was a huge question for the first century followers of Jesus. The big question for people who were engaging in life in the first century was this: how do I follow Jesus and live within the Roman Empire? How do I do that? How do I stay true and loyal to the values that I find in this person of Jesus? And how do I live in a world that maybe has differing values? And that was a huge question that they were facing. And because the stakes were so high, because many of the earliest followers of Jesus, like Paul, and some would even say Jesus himself, they believed that the world was going to end within their generation. Like Paul believed that the world as he knew it was going to end, it was going to be restored, and this was going to happen in his lifetime. How many of y'all know that's a high stakes belief? Right? Like, if that's what you believe, if that's what you hold, like, you are worried, how do I make sure that I live in a way that's consistent so that I'm on the right side of that equation, okay? Now, the revelation gives us one opinion to that question, one answer to that question. But it's not the only one that we have in the Bible. We also have an answer to this question of how to engage with culture and be kind of loyal and have an allegiance to like Jesus, but also kind of maintain your allegiance to your culture and your community. And that's given to us in what we call Luke Acts, these two books that were written together. They're separated in our Bible because who knows? Honestly, we just do some crazy things sometimes. And so we separated Luke Acts, but it's actually one volume. And it's about how this message of Jesus travels from like Galilee to Rome. And it's like a Paul's way of recognizing, it's the journey of Paul. And Paul gives us an answer to the question of how do you intersect with culture and how do you deal with the conflict that might be there. And then on top of that, Jesus gives us an answer to it. Like within our text, within our sacred text, this thing we call the Bible, the New Testament, we get three very diverse opinions about what to do with culture. How do we engage? You know, I don't know what worlds you grew up in church world, but sometimes there's the big question of like, are you allowed to listen to music that isn't Christian? Which, by the way, Christian is a terrible adjective, okay? It's a decent noun, a better verb, but horrible adjective. But like, are you allowed to do that? Should you play cards? Right? What is it like? How should you vote? Are you allowed to be part of a political party and to follow Jesus? Like, do you put your hand over your heart and pledge allegiance to the Christian flag? Are you allowed to pledge allegiance to an American flag? Like, these are real questions that a lot of communities wrestle with today. And these would be similar in nature to the questions that these early followers were. And so what I want to do today is talk about these three responses that we have from culture. I'll start with Revelation because that's the series that we're in. And I want to do it by looking at this big question that they had. One of the biggest questions that these folks had was, are we allowed to eat meat sacrificed to idols? That was one of the big questions. I mean, a hot topic of the day. Because the common belief was if you ate food that was sacrificed to an idol, somehow you were receiving the power of that God into your life. Hence why when Jesus says, if you eat my flesh and drink my blood, right? That there's this idea there that by consuming that, I'm actually being imbibed with the power of that God. So it's kind of a controversial issue. If you were Jewish, you're monotheistic, you only believed in one God, and you had all this food. And it'd be very hard to find meat that wasn't sacrificed to idols in the marketplaces, things like that. You have to be very specific. So that question is the one I want to ask. How does the Revelation respond? How does Paul respond? And how does Jesus respond? Are you with me? Are you excited? Are you like, I'm so glad I came to church today? I'm so glad I'm tuning in? I don't believe you all. Feelings are hurt. Okay, no. So here's the deal. The Revelation, because that's what we're series in, offers separation as the solution to dual allegiances to Christ and culture. So the Revelation says you got to separate yourself. This is the idea that you reject the surrounding culture, you withdraw into a community, and you maintain your distinct identity. So this approach was taken by people and groups that saw fundamentally the Roman Empire is evil and it is incompatible with any Christian value. And this was John's vision. This was John's understanding of how you ought to respond to this because judgment is coming. Right? We talked about this last week. Babylon, the Roman Empire is Babylon, and they're completely evil, and you need to be separate so that you don't face that judgment. Now, we know that John's response was, you don't eat meat sacrificed to idols. That will bring judgment on you. Wrong, bad idea, terrible idea. This is what he says in Revelation chapter 2, verse 14. I have a few things against you. How many of y'all know that is just a lovely opening conversation? Show up, your spouse is like, I'm glad you're here. I have a few things against you. It's like we just receive that with an open heart, right? He says, you hold the teachings of Balaam. You like this guy who taught Balak. How many of you all know who Balaam and Balak are, right? There's just like, nobody knows who these people are. If you're a healthy individual, you're like, why would I know who Balaam and Balak are, Ryan? I have a life. Okay, these are terms that refer to a story in the Hebrew scripture, okay? But all you need to know is they're not good, okay? It's not a good idea to be called Balaam, okay? It's like, yeah. All right, so says they put a stumbling block in front of the people of Israel so that they would eat food sacrificed to idols and engage in sexual immorality. And then later on, a few verses later, John says it again to a different group. He says, nevertheless, and he amps it up. He says, I have this against you. You tolerate that woman Jezebel. What? Jezebel? She calls herself a prophet. By her teaching, she misleads my servants into what? Sexual immorality and the eating of food sacrificed to idols. This is bad, you don't do it. So Revelation's perspective, separate yourself, strictly prohibited. Do not do it. You will be condemned if you do it. You will fall under judgment. You're just as bad as Revelation. You're following false prophets. Terrible idea. Don't do it. That's Revelation. Now, so John's idea when it comes to cultural issues between Rome and following Jesus is complete separation. Reject the culture. It's under judgment. Stay away from it. Separate yourselves out, right? Come out of Babylon. That's the phrase that John uses. So he has this real separatist mentality. Now, we have modern examples of this within the Christian movement, okay? Now, as I give you some modern samples of this, I'm going to do my best not to offer these as a criticism of them, as to just say they're following this model, okay? Does that make sense? I'm not here to judge another man's servant. That's not what I'm doing, okay? So I'm just saying these particular expressions of our tradition, I say our if you're part of the Christian tradition, they tend to fit more into the separatist model. So if you think of groups like the Amish, maybe you're familiar with other Anabaptist groups. Like these are like expressions of our tradition that fall into this idea of separation, that believe in this response. So these groups, they deliberately kind of maintain a distinct way of life. They're separate from mainstream society. They reject modern technology sometimes, avoid political involvement. And it's really motivated by this desire to live out what they believe is a more authentic faith, and it's free from corrupting influence of contemporary culture, okay? So these folks would like say separation is the answer. So that's John's response, okay? Now, what is Paul in Luke, Acts, and in some of his letters, what's Paul's response? Well, Paul's response is accommodation. Paul offers accommodation as a legitimate response or solution to dual allegiances, okay? So accommodation means we kind of adapt and compromise within the dominant culture of the empire. So some early Christian communities, they chose to accommodate Roman cultures. And they did this for, pretty pragmatic reasons, to avoid unnecessary persecution, right? They did this to gain kind of social acceptance, to consider to be part of their community. And so for Paul, accommodation was how you would interact with the powers of Rome and this world. Paul, in a lot of ways, would say, hey, the ultimate reality of the Christian faith, and he wouldn't say that because there was no such thing as Christianity, but he would say, Jesus is not incompatible with Rome. And that's why he's desperate to get to Rome. And when he gets arrested, he wants to go before the emperor as a Roman citizen. And he's desperate. I got to get to Rome. I got to get to Rome. His letter to the Romans, you can see some of that. Right? And so how does Paul answer the food question? Well, he doesn't answer it the same way John does. In this little letter we have from Paul to a group called the Corinthians, we get two passages where Paul deals very specifically with this idea of meat sacrificed to idols. So in 1 Corinthians chapter 8, Paul says this, now concerning food sacrificed to idols, right? The big question, are we allowed to eat it? Should we? They're eating it, we're not. Paul says, all of us possess knowledge. All of us possess knowledge. In other words, what I'm about to say to you, you all know this. But he says, but remember, knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. I'm trying to build one another up. And then he goes on a few verses later and he says, hence, as we're talking about this idea of food sacrificed to idols, we know, right, this is the knowledge that we know, no idol in the world really exists. Paul recognizes that these idols that they're sacrificing meats to, they're vapors in the wind, it's foolishness. We know that there is no God but one. But then he goes on and he says, but it's not everyone, however, who has this knowledge. Not everyone knows this. And so since some have become accustomed to idols until now, they still think that the food they eat as offered to an idol and their conscience being weak is defiled. So they still think that doing that harms their eternality, harms them, harms their soul. It defiles them. It makes them unclean. And then Paul goes on and he says, food will not bring us closer to God. And to that, I would say Paul has never had a great steak dinner, okay? But whatever, all right? But he says food doesn't bring us closer to God. We're no worse off if we do not eat and no better off if we do. But he says this, but take care that this liberty of yours, this freedom of yours, doesn't become a stumbling block to the weak. So he says, it doesn't matter. It doesn't really matter. And he expounds on this a little bit more in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, where he talks about all things are permitted, but not all things are beneficial. All things are permitted, but not all things build up. And love builds up, and we want to live in love. So don't seek to your own advantage, right? But that of the other. Think about the other person. And then he gives this really practical thing. He says, eat whatever is sold in the market without raising any questions. I love that. Just don't ask. Just don't ask. Don't make it a matter of conscience, for the earth and its fullness are the Lord's. But, he says, if an unbeliever invites you to a meal and you're disposed to go and you want to go, just eat whatever they put out before you. Don't ask any questions on the ground of conscience. Don't say, where did this meat come from? Don't do that. He says, it's no big deal. Just eat it. But if someone says to you at the meal, this has been offered to sacrifice, this meat has been offered as a sacrifice, then don't eat it. Don't eat it out of consideration for the one who informed you and for the sake of conscience. And he says, I mean their conscience, not yours. That you're just doing this out of love for the other person. He says, for why should my freedom be subject to the judgment of someone else's conscience? So it's not your own conscience. It's not like, oh, I ate it now. I'm a bad person because no. If I partake with thankfulness, why should I be denounced because of that for which I give thanks? I don't know if you know this or not, but this is a totally different answer than John. Right? Like, same Bible, by the way. I'm not making this up. You can look it up yourself. Like, John says, don't do it. You're going to face judgment. Paul's like, come on. Like, I don't know that John and Paul would have formed the Beatles back then. I really don't. I think they probably would have broke up a lot sooner, okay? But it's a totally different answer. Now, modern examples of this, people who will accommodate groups within the Christian tradition that will leverage culture, right, to accomplish what they believe is the vision of the faith, right? So modern mainline Protestant denominations will oftentimes do this, right? Modern mainline denominations will take on a kind of a modern liberal democratic way of being, and they'll advocate for social justice, inclusivity, kind of progressive values, and they do that within some of the structures of that kind of way of being in the world. They'll look for common ground, they'll work within the culture. It's a totally reasonable way to do that. It's in alignment with how Paul functioned. Now, whether you agree with what their vision of the Christian faith is a totally different story, but they'll leverage kind of ways that are accepted by culture and community. There's something called the prosperity gospel, prosperity churches. Prosperity churches accommodate to modern capitalistic values, right? So this idea that you're successful in America when you have wealth. You know that you've made it and arrived when you're comfortable. And this is a sign of God's favor and blessing. And so they're going to adapt and align with pretty contemporary cultural ideas of success based upon their vision of Christianity. Christian nationalism, which I'm going to say very clearly is a terrible idea. Christian nationalism, I think, is horrible, is awful. I think it's something that we should stand against. I just want to be super clear on this so you know, like, who this pastor is. Like, I think there's a difference between being patriotic and being a Christian nationalist. But Christian nationalism, which is found primarily in segments of the modern evangelical church, involves oftentimes aligning Christian identity with national identity, like bringing the two together. And it's particularly here in the United States. And this movement tends to closely associate Christian values with specific political agendas, and they often align with certain political parties. And it's usually conservative political parties, right? And in doing that, there's an accommodation that takes place that will even promote certain aspects of contemporary political culture, right? Including high levels of nationalism, militarism, capitalism, bringing it all together. And they'll leverage political influence, they'll seek political influence, right? So that their interpretation of the kingdom of God, of Christian values, right, can flourish. So there's an accommodation that takes place there, all right? So these are kind of modern ways in which people will accommodate their values, and they'll say, hey, here's things in culture that we can partner with. Now, Jesus offers a third alternative, okay? The third way in which Jesus offers us in this question of culture is something we call subversion, okay? Subversion, are you with me? Now I know you're thinking, oh, this is the Jesus way, so here we go, right? Stick with me. So Jesus offers subversion. He says this really is the solution to dual allegiances, right? Now, subversion involves challenging and undermining the dominant culture from within, okay? So it's this idea of using tools and symbols of the culture to critique and resist it, right? So it's a critique and a resistance from within, not from outside. And this approach can be subtle sometimes. It can be very distinct, right? Oftentimes Jesus would use parables. His parables are great examples of subversion, right? And we don't oftentimes read them subversively, just unfortunately because of the culture that we're in, that we miss it. But the parables are oftentimes, his teachings are very subversive. Things that we would say are definitely subversive, you might still say is like when Jesus says, blessed are the poor, for they will inherit the kingdom of heaven. Like, blessed are the poor. That is a very subversive statement because we would never say that the kingdom of God or that success is found in poverty. Yet that was one of Jesus's hallmark teachings, that there was something special about the divine being experienced amongst the poor and the struggling. So Jesus's teachings would often subvert Roman values and even his religious values. And they would subvert them, and he would offer an alternative vision for things like power and justice and what real community was. And this was how the historical Jesus and the Jesus of faith, right? This is how, like, this Jesus would say, this is how you interact with Rome and this world. I put that in quotes because that's kind of a technical phrase, theologically speaking, right? This world was often used. So how does Jesus deal with food? Well, Jesus, in Matthew chapter 15, this is what Jesus says. He calls the crowd over to him, and he says to the crowd, listen and understand. Pay attention. It's not what goes into the mouth that defiles a person, but it is what comes out of the mouth that defiles them. Okay. So the disciples come up to him, and they were like, hey, J-Man, I don't know if you know this or not, but what you just said did not go over well with the Pharisees. They took pretty deep offense to that when they heard what you said, that it's not what you eat that defiles you, but what you say. And Jesus answers, oh, I'm so sad for the Pharisees. We should be more sensitive. No. Jesus answers, and he says, every plant that my heavenly Father has not planted will be uprooted. And they're like, what are you talking about, Jesus? We're talking about the Pharisees. And he's like, yeah, and every plant that my Father doesn't plant will be uprooted. Leave them alone. Leave them alone. They're blind guides of the blind. This is Jesus, right? They're blind guides of the blind. And if one blind person guides another, both are going to fall into a pit. Let it happen. Whoa. And Peter's like, okay, explain the parable to us. We don't get it. And he's like, are you still without understanding? I'm so frustrated with you people. Why me, God? I have a feeling that was like Jesus' ultimate prayer around the disciples. Why me? He probably said, why me, God? And so he says, well, don't you see that whatever goes into the mouth enters, and he gives them like an anatomy lesson, right? Goes into the mouth and out into the sewer. But what comes out of the mouth proceeds from the heart. And this is what defiles. For out of the heart come evil intentions, and out of the heart come murder and adultery and sexual immorality and theft and false witness and slander. And by the way, you should note that these are all behaviors that wound other people. Okay? Totally different than eating something that somehow wounds God. Jesus is refocusing things here. And he says, these are what defile a person, but to eat with unwashed hands? Come on. Seriously, guys? That doesn't do it. So Jesus challenges in this moment the traditional religious norms of the purity laws and how you stay pure. And he's like, no, that's not what it is. It doesn't matter what you put inside what you eat. So he totally subverts that by this parable and by this story and by just kind of letting the Pharisees like off on their own little la-la land thinking this stuff actually matters. He redefines what purity actually is. He says it's not what goes in that makes you clean or unclean, it is what comes out. Now, here's something for those of us that grew up in tradition that said, oh yeah, food doesn't matter, but what you listen to matters. What you read matters. Don't you dare read Harry Potter. I'm just kidding. You can read Harry Potter, all right? I know some Potterheads in here, and I don't want to, you're good people. It's good people. It's the gospel, by the way, if you've ever read Harry Potter, but at any rate. I would suggest that Jesus would even say, what are you talking about? No. It's not even that goes into you. That doesn't defile you. That doesn't make you unclean. It doesn't make you an issue, right? Let's be honest. Like the modern word for impure is like, you're an issue. Like you're an issue to this world. Like there's a problem here. And what makes you a problem is how you treat other people, what you say to other people. Like that's the real issue. So he redefines what clean and unclean is. Like totally subverts it with this little statement, right? This little parable. Like, well, what my Father hasn't planted will be uprooted, right? And he's re-explaining these things. And what I love the best about this, and this is crazy because some of you who've been around the Bible a lot, you're not going to believe this, but like Jesus actually is less sensitive on the issue than Paul. Right? Like, Paul's like, you got to think about the other person. Paul's like, yeah, but the Pharisees have feelings too. Right? And Jesus is like, let them fall in a pit. He doesn't mean that literally, but he does, right? He's like, they're going to destroy themselves. Don't even worry about it. Just steer clear of it. He doesn't care about offending the Pharisees. Because he's not about accommodation. He's not about separation. He's about subversion. He's about identifying the principalities, the things of this world that are against and in contradiction to what he understands the kingdom of God to be, what he understands righteousness to be, which is justice, care for the poor, inclusion, all of these things. So some modern day examples of this kind of like deeply subversive faith movement. So the Catholic worker movement that was founded by Dorothy Day, really an exemplification of a subversive approach to modern culture, right? And then you have the Poor People's Campaign of recent years. If you've heard of the Poor People's Campaign, these are groups, people, organizations that are coming together to confront interlocking evils of systemic racism and poverty, ecological devastation, militarism, war economy. I'm trying to think who else I could possibly offend. Okay, but that's what they're doing, right? They're saying, hey, this is not the kingdom, and so we come together to subvert it. They want to distort this, they want to confront this distorted moral narrative of religious nationalism. So it's a great example of this idea of subverting it. And these movements, they really do seek to bring about and to challenge societal structures that result in injustice, particularly those ones that relate to poverty or war or inequality. And they do this by living out this radical way of Jesus. Okay, so those are some modern movements. Liberation theology is another great example of a subversive way of dealing with culture, right? So these align with marginalized groups. Jesus was always in alignment with the marginalized. So they align with marginalized groups. They advocate for change, systemic change, in ways that challenge the status quo of empire, okay? So here's what I don't want us to miss today. You're like, oh, thank you, because you just confused the snot out of me, Ryan. Like, what in the world? Accommodations, for like these stupid big words. So here's what I don't want us to miss, because we're talking about Revelation. I want to bring it all back to Revelation. Don't miss this. The Revelation gives us one biblical way that our spiritual ancestors answered the question of cultural engagement. One. Revelation does not give us the only way. It does not give us the right way. It does not give us the wrong way. It just gives us one way. So Revelation says this to our hearts: come out of Babylon. Get out of it. It's evil. It's destructive. And Revelation says, why should you do that? Because God is going to destroy it. That's Revelation. Come out of Babylon because God's going to destroy it. Paul basically says, be in Babylon, but not of Babylon. Like, be in it. God, and why? Why should you be in it? Because God will use it. God will use the structures and systems of this world. And that's what Paul believes. Like Christianity doesn't seek to destroy Rome, right? No, like God uses authorities in our lives. He says that as much in some of his letters, right? So Paul's response is, hey, be in it, but recognize the complexity of it. And sometimes, you can like leverage it, but you know what? Just be wise. Because God is going to use it. And then Jesus says, oh, hold on a second, transform Babylon. Transform Babylon with the kingdom of heaven. Why? Because God is present in it. Like, that's what Jesus says. Transform it with the kingdom of heaven because God is present in it. Now, in your everyday normal life, when you leave here and tomorrow you go, what was that all about? Is my life any better for having listened to that nonsense for 40 minutes? Okay? Here's what I think we ought to know from this whole thing. Today, we still have to make a choice. Every day of our lives, if we're following the peacemaking path of Jesus and we're intersecting with empire, and I hate to break the news to everybody, but we live in an empire. And how do we relate? I'm very happy to be an American, okay? I have no problems with that. No problem saying I'm proud of that fact. I love that. But I also recognize that I live amongst an empire and I am living my best to follow the path of Jesus, which is often distinct from the American dream. That the values oftentimes collide. So I'm still faced with the choice, and that choice is this: which one of these will be my guiding principle? Which one will guide me? Which will be the front wheel of the tricycle, right? Will it be accommodation? Will it be separation? Will it be subversion? For me, the front wheel is subversion. But I need the other two wheels. So when I say like, okay, subversion is kind of, for me, that following the peacemaking path of Jesus, that's not to say that accommodation and separation don't have their place. In fact, I'm going to argue that they do have a place. But oftentimes what we see within the Christian tradition, folks that focus on accommodation or they focus on separation, they live these out oftentimes in ways that reflect the religious culture or the beliefs of that day of Jesus rather than what's really happening today. So we'll separate ourselves from certain things and we'll miss what John was actually saying you're supposed to separate yourself from. What Paul was saying you should actually be accommodating to. So I want to encourage you to be a divergent peacemaker. We talked about that word a few weeks ago. Don't fit into any one of these three categories, right? Don't be just one or the other. That's fundamentalism. That's dangerous, whether you're liberal or whether you're conservative. Fundamentalism is the issue, to say there's no room for you here. So be divergent. Don't fit into any one category when you're engaging the complexity of empire. So here's what this means. Last week we talked about Team Dragon and Team Lamb, right? And how many of you recognize some days you're on Team Dragon? I just choose to believe most of the days I'm on Team Lamb. Most of the minutes of the day I'm trying to be on Team Lamb. Okay, but here's the thing I would say to you. We ought to be accommodating to any cultural norm that subverts Team Dragon. So we ought to accommodate any method, anything in our world that subverts the values of Team Dragon. We talked about that last week, right? So we should link arms. We should link arms with any person, any organization that models radical simplicity, that models grace, that models nonviolent resistance, that models inclusion, economic justice, right? These are the values that Team Dragon seeks to thwart. And so we should accommodate and leverage any means necessary to promote those. And it doesn't matter whether a person believes the same we do about God or about Jesus. if they're promoting these values, then we link arms together and we go, yes, this is great. We're subverting the dragon by accommodating to these methodologies. Luke chapter 9, the disciples come to Jesus and they're like, Jesus, we found this guy and he was casting out demons in your name, but he's not one of us. We told him to stop. And Jesus is like, oh my gosh. What is wrong with you? Don't stop him. And then Jesus makes this crazy statement, for whoever is not against you is for you. Whoever is not against you is for you. And so I live that out. So that's accommodation. Now, what about separation? Well, we should be separate from any cultural norm that subverts Team Lamb. So anything in our culture that would subvert the values of Team Lamb in Revelation, then we should separate ourselves from those things. So we should be separate from things like violence, opulence, the celebration of war and death, anything that demands total and unquestioning allegiance, anything that doesn't allow for questions. We should separate ourselves from those things, regardless of their beliefs or lack of beliefs about God and Jesus. And this is where it gets tricky, right? Because there are a whole lot of people, in my humble opinion, that are part of our tradition that are advocating for things that totally subvert the way of Jesus. And they do it in Jesus' name. Matthew 7:22. Jesus said this was going to happen. Many are going to come to me on that day, and they'll say, Lord, Lord, didn't we prophesy in your name, and in your name drive out demons, and in your name perform many miracles? And he says, I'm just going to tell them plainly, I have no idea who you are. New phone, who dis? I'm sorry. Like, just because someone says, oh, I follow Jesus, but the fruit is like, what? Celebrating war? Like not fighting for the rights of the poor? Huh? We should recognize, like, okay, I need to separate myself from that. And as we embrace this complexity of recognizing that, hey, there's moments where we subvert, there's moments where we accommodate, there's moments where we separate. That means we're leaning into the complexity of things. We're leaning into the complexity of our faith. And what do we learn? We learn the power of discernment. We become discerning people. And that grows in our lives, where I can discern, where do I see the values of Jesus flourishing? Where do I see them being opposed? And if we'll do that, if we'll start to discern when to accommodate, when to separate, as opposed to living them out as if there's some rule, like that every time in our lives, if a person doesn't go to your church or doesn't call themselves a Christian, separate, right? Or just accommodate with anything. Anytime we live these kind of black and white rules out, we're in danger. But when we embrace the complexity, here's what happens. Subversion, which is Jesus' vision, becomes the fruit. Right? Subversion is what happens when we discern when to accommodate and when to separate. We will naturally be subversive people when we learn, don't accommodate to that, separate from that. But when we do it according to the values of the Lamb, not the values of my religious tradition, not the values of what the American church says is right and wrong, not the values of the Republican Party or the Democratic Party or whatever else political party there is, but when we're asking this through the lens of the peacemaking values of Jesus, we will naturally be a subversive people. And that to me is the heart. That's what I want. That's how I want to engage with culture. I want to leverage the things that I have that I can say are beautiful about my culture and my community and say, this is where I see the Lamb flourishing and I'm going to accommodate and become a part of those things. And here's where I see Team Dragon kind of being, I got to separate away from that way of thinking. So as we have communion this morning, everyone's invited to the table. What is it that God's inviting you into is the question. I'm going to do something dangerous today. I'm going to invite you to watch a documentary called Bad Faith. And for some of you, this might be a real challenge because you're like me and maybe your heritage is a part of what this documentary exposes a bit of. But this documentary really does expose the dangers of Christian nationalism, kind of gives a history of some political movements within Christianity that have, and that are just pretty nefarious in my opinion. And so it's a documentary called Bad Faith. And in that documentary, you can learn more about the Poor People's Campaign, or you can go online and check it. But it's a great example of two dichotomies, like two values within the Christian tradition that are very different, that cause us to ask the question, like, which do I choose? Which will I accommodate? And so you can search that online and find it. I think you can watch it for free. Bad Faith. I want to encourage some of you that are following the peacemaking path of Jesus, revisit Matthew chapter 5 through 7. It's called the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew has taken kind of probably things that Jesus would have taught over and over and over again, and he compiles it into one sermon. And I would just encourage you to read that and ask yourself, which of these words are still subversive in nature? Which of these words are still challenging the values of empire even today? And then if you have a question about the revelation, something you've always wanted to ask or something I've said that you disagree with or you have a question about, write that on the Connect card so we can kind of discuss that in our online only experience in a couple of weekends. So we got this great song that we did maybe 2 months ago, something like that. You'll recognize, if you've been around church for a long time, you'll recognize the tune. It's an old hymn, the tune is. But the words have been changed to reflect a movement in the faith tradition of like kind of leaving toxic spirituality and that journey. And that's part of what today's about, is recognizing it is toxic to say that we always have to separate, or we always have to accommodate, or we always have to be subversive. But there's something beautiful about giving us the freedom to discern, to ask great questions, to not have to know all the answers, and to trust in the goodness of the universe. So if you're here today, you're welcome to the table. These symbols just remind us they are symbols about how much you are loved. They represent that the way to heal the world is not through violence, but is through nonviolence, is through forgiveness, through love of enemy. And so we say these words, the body of Christ broken for you, the blood of Christ shed for you, as a reminder, not that you're a terrible person and you needed these things, but that our world is filled with terrible things. And we oftentimes think that to meet and heal those terrible things, we have to do even more terrible things. But the way of Jesus says, no, it's in the height of your persecution, in the pain of your rejection, where you say, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Like, that heals the world. That rescues you. That changes everything. So the body of Christ broken for you, the blood of Christ shed for you. If you're in seats or on the bleachers, there's tables in the back. If you're at your tables, they're there. I would encourage you to sing this song, absorb it, listen to it, consider its message. And then we're going to sing one song together and get you out of here.